It is my pleasure to introduce for our next panel discussion, which will be about AVs and AV safety, a high interest topic, to introduce Greg McGuire. Many of you in this room know Greg already. For those of you who don't, he is the managing director of Mcity. He has been in that role about 9 years, I think. And he has been integral to the evolution of Mcity from the test facility itself, from connected and automated primary focus into a makerspace for mobility, where we're expanding beyond the ground and looking to the air, which is something we'll talk about more another day. But Greg, welcome to the podium.
All right, good morning. Thank you for being here. It will be tremendously difficult to follow that first panel, but as they say, we'll give it the old college try. And luckily there's a deep bench of Gregs here today. Hey, Greg. I'm serious. So we don't have to lean just on me. I'd like to invite our panelists up. Today's topic is, of course, around autonomous vehicles. How safe is safe enough? I think this is a topic we've talked about for decades, and yet 2025, here we are, still having this conversation. Today we're going to solve it. That's the charge of the panel. No, we're not, but we're going to take a good crack at it and talk about what's holding us back and what's left to do and who's going to be responsible for doing it. So I've got a powerhouse panel here, as a matter of fact, for the next hour. You all are charged with asking the questions that are on your mind in this topic, please, as we go. I won't take too long with my own questions. We've got panelists, so you want to come on up. We've got Amy Chu, who's the Senior Manager for Safety, Autonomous Mobility and Delivery at Uber. Cooper Lohr, the Senior Policy Analyst for Consumer Reports. Brian Simmons, Department Manager, Transportation Communications Engineering at MITRE. Greg Stevens, Research Director for us at Mcity. Jean-Paul Velez, who's the AV Policy Lead for the San Francisco County Transportation Authority, SFCTA. And last, alphabetically only, John Way, Director, Customer and Technology Research for State Farm. It's probably worth mentioning Greg was formerly Chief Engineer for ADAS Core Features at none other than Emily, you guessed it, Ford Motor Company. And Amy formerly ran the Automated Vehicle Safety Consortium. So some of our past experiences, I think, are really relevant here, even though we won't be speaking for those organizations. I'd like to give each panelist just a couple minutes to give a little bit more on their background than what I just did. If you don't mind, Amy, you can lead us off.
I get to go first.
Okay, I'm going to move away from the higher level podium here and sit with you all.
All right, so thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here today and see all your faces. My name's Amy Chu. I currently am with Uber as Senior Safety Manager for our Autonomous and Mobility Department. And we are currently partnering with multiple different types of autonomous companies, really to just get them out there safely, making sure that we're advancing the industry and doing it in a safe way. We sort of represent the public trust aspect as well through our very large mobility network. And so that's really a charge that I'm honored to be a part of. As Greg mentioned, I was the former director of the AVSC, that's the Automated Vehicle, See, this is what happens when I go first. Thank you. Automated Vehicle Safety Consortium, AVSC, and that's a group of industry companies that get together and write best practices when it comes to AV safety. We really tried to get everybody together to come to 100% consensus on these best practices. And as you can imagine, that's not an easy thing to do. As the director, I was wrangling, trying to get everybody to agree. But it's actually a really good space because it's taking the experts, getting them in a room and saying, what do we think is important when it comes to safety? And then agreeing on it. And then saying, yes, we will go forward this way. So I loved being a part of that. I bring that with me into Uber. And really, just excited to be a part of this technology. In my past, I actually stood up the cybersecurity engineering group, Center of Excellence within Harman. So my majority of my experience has been with the automotive industry in the tier 1 space. So I also bring that to, how are we going to do this? How safe is safe enough? It's a really easy topic that you chose for us today. So looking forward to talking with you all.
Sure. My name is Cooper Lohr. I'm with Consumer Reports, where I help lead our policy and advocacy work as it relates to advancing safer vehicles on our roads. I think most people probably know CR as a testing and ratings organization, especially with cars. But a large part of what we do is leverage insights from our testers and our researchers to help advance pro-consumer policies at various levels of government throughout the country, right? So, on this topic of AV deployment and how to safely deploy these technologies, we at CR think we're very well equipped to at least represent the consumer perspective on this issue, just given our years of work in evaluating new vehicle technologies. So really happy to be here. I'm excited for the discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Brian?
Good morning. I'm Brian Simmons. I'm the Chief Engineer for Surface Transportation at the MITRE Corporation. If you're not familiar with MITRE, we were chartered 65 years ago by Congress to work in the public interest, specifically to help government agencies transition to disruptive new emerging technologies. At the time, the disruptive technology then, when we were founded, was digital computing. But we've continued to support federal agencies on lots of different topics. Certainly, we're involved in autonomous vehicles in a couple different ways. We're supporting government agencies with incorporating autonomous vehicles into their operational missions, so primarily DoD, Homeland Security, those sorts of things. So we are involved in the technology side and transitioning into autonomous-based operations. But there are a lot of other agencies that we work with where adopting or transitioning to autonomy involves more non-operational roles. For instance, regulation or enabling those. So those sorts of regulatory or enabling roles are also what we do. So very pleased to be here. I think something that MITRE's particularly interested in is as we accelerate the adoption of a new technology, how do we avoid analysis paralysis? And when there's so much good research being done on such an important topic, when we see something that's maybe not moving, at the rate we'd like to see, how do we back up and take a look at the questions we're answering and see if there's different approaches?
Appreciate that. How about you, Jean-Paul?
Good morning. Thank you for having me here today.
Yeah.
Yes, my name is Jean-Paul Velez. I'm with the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. I would say that the background that we bring to this idea of automation comes from San Francisco being the epicenter for many mobility innovations over the last couple of decades, and developing the experience of collaborating with different providers, as well as developing the policy frameworks for better leveraging those technologies to advance city transportation goals. So one of our roles at the SFCTA is the Congestion Management Agency role, for which we do performance assessment of our network, and one of the critical variables for doing so is safety. So this question that we're tackling today is very critical to our work. And as Greg was suggesting, there's no consensus yet on the answer to this question of what is safe, how is safe enough for AVs. yet we still see this expansion of AVs to many more cities, in the news over and over and over. So it's an interesting conundrum because it does feel at times like we're putting the cart before the horse. And so in San Francisco, we have the experience of having been one of the early deployment sites. And in that case, we bring a lot of, again, experiences and perspective that I'm hoping we can discuss today.
Thank you. John, you want to?
Happy to. Yeah, good morning. Save the other Greg for last.
Yeah,
It's
that's
that way
right.
you don't make me go last again. That's
right.
very nice
That's
of
right.
you, Greg.
I want to be conscious.
Good morning, everyone. John Way from State Farm Insurance. Greg wanted Jake, but Jake was way too expensive. As we've already discussed, resources are scarce.
Would not believe that guy's retainer.
So you
Yeah.
get John and not Jake. But John has been with the company almost 20 years and currently have responsibility for our consumer and technology research explorations. And coolest job in the company by far. I feel bad talking about that back home, but I don't feel bad talking about that here. And it's the coolest job in the company because I get to invest in better understanding safety and safety for our shared customer. We have a deep and rich history of doing that at State Farm. We've been around for 103 years. Go back a couple decades, and we did extensive work with IIHS in support and advancement of seatbelt safety and the advancement of seatbelts in automobiles. A couple decades ago, worked extensively with the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia to do a fair amount of work around passenger safety and child passenger safety specifically. And more recently here with our good friends at UMTRI and Mcity, have been trying to better understand what that next frontier of safety is. And certainly automation and connectivity is at the heart of what will be our concern around consumer safety on a going forward basis. So how can we at State Farm better collaborate with those that know best around what those future impacts are and how we can meet that with products and services. So grateful to be here on the 60th anniversary of UMTRI and certainly appreciative of the partnership we have with our friends here at University of Michigan.
Thanks, John. And State Farm has been with us since the beginning of Mcity. They helped create it. I saved Greg for last, not because for Greg jokes, but because I'd like, Greg, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, but also then if you could set the stage a little bit. One of the things that I've had the privilege of working with Greg over the years, it's going to sound awkward talking about myself in the third person, is, no one that I've met can take and distill complex ideas in a way that I can immediately and intuitively understand like he can. So I thought it would be a good way to frame the conversation by having him kind of go through the problem a little bit. A couple of PowerPoint slides, and talk through as he sees where we're at, so we can level set everybody and start from there.
Good, thanks, Greg.
Yeah.
First, my intro. So I'm the research director at Mcity. I've been doing this job for a little over 2 years now. It's been a really, really wonderful experience for me. The role as research director basically was to come in from industry and look at sharpening our research bets. So instead of sort of a scattershot research agenda, really sort of focusing, picking some specific emerging themes and investing specifically in them and driving projects. And specifically to sort of get at what the last panel was trying to get at is, these things are happening in academia, and these things are needed by industry, and how do we bring that together, right? So prior, I was at Ford, chief engineer for the driver assist features. So I got to work on Blue Cruise, I got to work on all the accident avoidance features, intersection safety features, the parking features, the trailering features. So really a tremendous experience there, and also a chance to work in full autonomous driving. So, a really nice background that sort of led into a second career here in academia. And so if we could jump into the slides now, basically this idea of how safe is safe enough, right? It's just like, it's tough when this question is hanging over your head for so long, right? But it's a really important question. And I put there on the side also, currently that's a corporate decision, right? Each AV company is making that decision on their own. One of the questions we're asking is, should it be a corporate decision, or is this a larger societal, consensus that needs to be reached. And if we could go to the next slide, actually I have the clicker, I can handle that. So I want to do a thought experiment to sort of, look into this idea a little bit of is this a societal question or not, right? And about 40,000 people die on the roadways every year in the United States. And so let's think about jumping forward in time to a future where AVs are pervasive, right? And let's think about two potential headlines that we could see. One that we would be super excited about is autonomous vehicles reduce fatalities by 90%, saving 36,000 lives every year in the United States, right? That's an amazing, amazing headline if we could see that at some point. But there's another headline that's equally plausible, which is, what about the other 10%, right? So AI robots kill 4,000 people per year in the US, and no one can explain why, right? This is a shocking headline. It's also very plausible, right? There is chaos in the world, right? No system is perfect. There will be accidents. Accidents will happen. And AI especially has this problem of explainability, or I should say unexplainability, right? It's a black box, right? And so when people say, why did this happen? The truthful answer is, I don't know, because AI is a black box. And when they say, how can you make sure this never happens again? You say, I can't give you that guarantee. I can retrain the model, I can make it less probable, but I can't guarantee it won't occur again. The thing to think about with this is you can't choose a world where there's one of those headlines is true and the other's not. You take both or you take neither, really. So that's why we think about this being as sort of a larger societal journey that we're all on, not an individual corporate journey. So how safe is safe enough? Who wants to know, right? You look at the distribution of our panel and you'll see, right? But first and foremost, the general public wants to know, right? We will be driving next to AVs. We will be stepping into crosswalks in front of AVs. We will be sitting in robo-taxis. Public safety advocates need to understand risks and benefits. Regulators need to understand whether to issue permits. In litigation, they need to understand how to allocate fault and liability. Insurance companies need to figure out how to underwrite risks. The AV companies themselves are interested in standards because when bad things happen, it's good to be able to say that you've aligned to standards, right? Mobility providers, like could be Uber and Lyft, who are putting AVs into their fleets, need to know. It could also be the OEMs who are maybe developing their own technologies or licensing technologies need to know. Investors who provide the financing that makes AVs possible need to know. And one of the great things is Waymo this past summer put out a really nice paper. It's the link there at the bottom. It's in archive. You can find it. And they laid out their 12 acceptance criteria for road readiness. So anytime there's any major change on the vehicle, this is the process that they use, that they go through to go through 12 different things that they present to their safety board for why their autonomous vehicle is safe for road readiness. And you look at this and you go, wow, that looks pretty comprehensive, and kudos to Waymo because it is. It's a very good framework, and I'm glad they published it. And so you ask yourself, so what's missing, right? And there's two sentences in the paper that I've quoted here that say, targets and quantitative benchmarks are not included in this paper. Minimum benchmarks will need to be agreed upon broadly by industry and regulators, but only after a more precise conversation on which metrics and indicators can be used to aggregate residual risk is undertaken. So Waymo didn't release their targets and benchmarks. They clearly have them internally, but that's their secret sauce, right? You can't expect them to deliver that to the world. Otherwise, they would lose their competitive benefit. But they clearly recognize that this broader conversation needs to happen. And that's what we're going to do today, right? We're going to start that conversation. We're going to restart the conversation. And we see this as an iterative consensus-building conversation, gathering together, creating actual straw man proposals. So on those 12 things, what would the criteria be? And then iterating until we reach consensus. So that's our plan.
All right, I know each of you as lovely humans, and so I'm gonna say let's have this as a conversation. We don't need to come back to me every time. This audience knows they don't need to hear me every time. So feel free to riff off of each other as we go. They know this. We've already talked about it, but I'm telling you. All right. I mean, let's start out with some basic framing. Thank you, Greg, for that, by the way. What is how safe is safe enough? What does that mean to you in this context when we even say that? I mean, I've thought about it so many times. I'm not sure I have a good understanding of that anymore in my head. Who wants to start?
I can start.
Yeah.
You want to go?
Yeah. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I can start just really quickly. I think it's a really good question. It's a challenging question, but I think the other part of that question is like safe compared to what, right? And right now that's safer compared to a human driver, right? So I think the simple answer to how safe is safe enough is demonstrably safer than a human driver. Of course, how do you measure that? How do you determine that? That's a whole nother challenge. But a system that performs reliably 95% of the time, but then makes a mistake that a human would never make, like that's not safe enough, right? So.
I completely agree. And I think one of the challenges that we have is thinking of that as a single question with a single answer. Your slide, Greg, where you listed the many different stakeholders. I don't think we're going to make a lot of progress believing that there's one sort of North Star, there's one path to one answer, and if we coordinate all the research properly, we're all going to agree on those targets and thresholds. I think the question of how safe is safe enough is going to have to be answered by society, not just a corporate answer. And there are so many different stakeholder groups with different perspectives and priorities within that society. They're all going to have to wrestle with this question at some point, kind of independently. Policymakers are going to have to balance the requirements of safety targets and thresholds that they expect for their community with other policy priorities that they're going to have as well. Insurance companies are going to have to make their decisions on insuring these operations and private citizens as well. It's difficult and it's frustrating, I think, to take a question like this and seemingly make it more complicated by agreeing that we want to tackle it in different ways with different frameworks and different targets. But I think that's the only way that we're going to begin to make incremental progress is by decomposing it a little bit and trying to get some progress. I think as long as it remains we have some expectation that industry and academia are going to work together and come up with the answer, I think we'll be stuck. We're never really going to make that progress.
I really like what you said, incremental progress, because safety is one of Uber's core values. We hear a lot our slogan, "Safety never stops." So when I hear the question, "How safe is safe enough?" Enough for where? Enough for when? Enough for how long? I think that question could be branched off into multiple different places. And I think, determining is it safe enough for, your deployment, your specific deployment? The answer could be yes, based on certain criteria. And also getting that diversified answer from different groups, I think is really, really important. But in my opinion, I think we have to keep asking that question over and over again, regardless of whether we've got an answer today. And, tomorrow there could be a new answer.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Amy. I mean, from the insurer's perspective, right, and similar to what Brian said, we'll let society and public policy determine truly what safe enough means to us as a society. To the insurer, it means zero fatalities for our automobile operators. Now, that's probably not realistic. And as we think about the cost of society from a repair perspective, what does it cost to build a vehicle that prevents fatalities at all costs, right? That becomes a really tough thing to ensure from a cost perspective. Most importantly, as we think about automation and connectivity on a going forward basis, it's really important for the insurers to have a benchmark or a place to start in understanding what is or is not safe on a going forward basis. Insurance is full of uncertainty. I mean, that is the nature of our business. But the extent to which we can have a jumping off point for understanding as a new GM model, as a new Ford model enters the market and it is equipped with certain things, we should begin to expect this type of on-road performance or this type of outcome for society. And right now, we operate almost entirely blindly in that capacity. And so the extent to which we can collaborate collectively across industry to begin developing and implementing frameworks to create that understanding will benefit all of us significantly, and perhaps none of us more so than the insurer. We desperately want to seek understanding, and I think this group and this collective of people help us gain that understanding on a going forward basis.
Yeah, I'll jump in precisely on that point. Like, the fact that we don't have readily available answers doesn't mean that we should not kind of start to strive for them. And a part of the challenge is to figure out how either academia or regulations or policy are developed in a way that is flexible to reflect that uncertainty and allow us to get faster to some of those answers. And so, for instance, yeah, the lack of standards in our regulations, it seems or feels like a gaping hole because it doesn't offer any assurances of safety to the public. And I think that's part of the answer of how safe is safe enough, where you can tell the public, hey, it's okay to like actually jump on this vehicle. And right now, again, all of that trust is deposited really just on the private operator, because the regulations don't create much of a performance benchmark for them to meet. And so to build on that, I guess to develop those tools would allow us to then develop more comprehensive systems for mitigating risk. And so that's when kind of, for instance, us, the city that is intaking all of the operators, find the gap. We don't have any tools to actually better create pathways for the deployment in a way that manages our citizens' risk.
So that's a great segue, because I know that you've built the safety-focused AV permitting framework at SFCTA. To my knowledge, it has some numbers on it of where certain thresholds should be. I don't know that I've seen that before in a public setting, outside of internal company metrics. Why did you do that? What was the sort of impetus for that? Because, we've talked before about this. Your ability to kind of enforce that is low at the moment. It's a state level kind of conversation, right? Yeah. So what drove you to do that? Is it that same?
I'm happy to share more.
Yeah.
Basically reflecting on our experiences, seeing sort of like that first generation of providers go from testing with safety drivers to testing driverless to full deployment commercial services in our city. We found important gaps in the current regulatory framework. And so some of those gaps related precisely to what I was mentioning before, risk mitigation. It was about gaps in transparency, and there were gaps in performance evaluation. So these are things that we were not seeing in our existing kind of framework. So, and all of those we believe are crucial for the successful integration of AVs into our day-to-day transportation network, and that notion again of building public trust. So we developed a proposal. It's just a conceptual idea of how we think a permitting framework could operate. And the core elements of that framework are incrementality and performance evaluation. And so to the extent that you, for instance, can start testing in a small controlled section of a city or a larger ODD, then you can actually start to increase your operations to more complex areas of the city, or increase them in scale in terms of numbers of vehicles or other elements that may add complexity to your operations, to the extent that your performance is confirmed to meet a certain threshold, right? And so once you confirm a certain level, you would be allowed to do more complex things. So that is at least the idea, which is how we felt as we were seeing that certain providers in our city were not kind of meeting a standard, yet they were allowed to continue to expand, and that created a lot of anxiety for us managing the streets. And so yes, we took a stab at putting some numbers on the table, but just to start the conversation. So just for everyone's sake, these are mostly sample numbers. And so we kind of reflected both on basically the average kind of NHTSA crash figures, and then we just use that as an idea of what the standard could be, but the standards should be, again, much more tailor-made to specific ODDs and whatnot. But I think, again, the idea was just to start this conversation in a more tangible way, because the other question is, the NHTSA averages for crashes are for all humans, and I think that's an important question as well. Should the standard be the average human crash rate, where we include humans that are looking at their cell phone or they're, inebriated or whatever the case may be, or should we actually set a higher bar, maybe a human driver that is fully attentive and in full control of the vehicle? And so these are things that we all should discuss, but again, the idea was just precisely to start a conversation, because we were finding in our conversations with regulators that the conversation wasn't happening. So I'm glad that this space is created for that.
And, the thing I like about the proposal you made is it seems to have an analog with what we do with humans, right? Where it's sort of like, when I was reading it, it reminded me of graduated licensing for our teenagers, right? Where you get your learner's permit first, and you convince your parents you're good enough and your driver's ed instructor, and then you get there's that middle one, and then the final full one, right? So a very sort of, I think, nice sort of human analog to sort of training an AI driver like we train human drivers. And the other part I appreciated about it is it's a straw man proposal, right? Which is what we've been talking about. When you go to somebody and you say, tell me how safe is safe enough, they go, I don't know how to answer that question. But if you go to somebody and say, here's a proposal for how safe is safe enough, what do you think of this proposal? Then people can go, oh, I think that's too aggressive or too conservative, right? So you gotta put something out there, right? And I don't know if it's true or not, but I remember a colleague told me that the idea that the phrase straw man proposal came from the fact that like soldiers used to do bayonet practice on straw men, right? You'd like take a scarecrow or something and stab your bayonet in it, right? And I think that's what we gotta get ready for, is that kind of a discussion, right? Where we go, here's our straw man proposal, and everybody comes with their bayonets and says, and we go, okay, that's good feedback, thanks, right? And then we adapt, right? We change our proposal, make a new one, right? That's why I think this will be a very iterative process, but, I'm grateful to San Francisco Transportation Authority for putting that out there as a first one, right? And I think, it needs to be expanded, right? Because you mentioned yours is mainly about sort of operational safety. So it's like after the companies say, I got something I think is safe enough, yours then takes it to, okay, now that we're rolling it out in the city, how do we do it in a graduated way? I think there's a whole nother part of the discussions that happen up front, which is how did the companies design in safety? And how did they prove internally that they thought it was safe enough to even come to you and say, we're putting it out in your city? But yeah, kudos for making the straw man. Appreciate it.
If I could jump in, I think the human analogy is super important here. I know that I, personally as an engineer, I never really want to embrace the human analogy, setting the human performance as the benchmark, because I know how horrible humans are as drivers. It seems like a terrible idea, but when you want to engage the community, when it becomes a societal issue, I think it's unavoidable to have to frame it up and have those conversations against human analogies. The idea of the graduated licensing, or even talking about what self-certification means. I think to some extent human drivers self-certify a little bit, right? And being able to talk to communities about autonomous vehicles, not from engineering terms. You know, I like the Waymo decomposition that you put up there. It's pretty understandable, but there is some engineering decomposition there that may not appeal or be understood by most people. But taking the driving function and breaking it into parts that a human being would say, oh yeah, I know I do route planning, and I know I do scanning for pedestrians. I know I do these things. And being prepared to talk about how those functions are performed and how well they're performed in ways that humans can relate to is going to be unavoidable and important, at least initially.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback really quickly off that. To your point about breaking down some of the functions of automated systems and making them simple for consumers to understand, that's definitely what we try and do with our evaluative process when it comes to driver assistance features and lower levels of automation. I think a challenge that we see as we kind of go up the levels of automation is that the perceived safety benefit becomes a lot less clear. And as we start getting into L2 and L2 plus and L3, it's, are these features for convenience or are they for safety, right? At least with lower level assistance features like AEB and blind spot warning, there's evidence there that it can reduce crashes and ultimately help save lives, which is why we push for standardization for those types of features. But again, as we go up the levels of automation, it becomes a lot less clear that safety component, that safety benefit. And again, when we start talking about fully handing over the driving task, right, with robo-taxis and full self-driving technology, that becomes even more of a challenge, right? Because I think once the sort of the shimmer and the shine of the new technology, I think, wears off, if you don't have a super compelling safety case, I think consumers are going to have a really hard time fully handing over the driving task and being willing to do that.
I mean, thinking about that and public trust, I mean, do we know what the public wants in this regard? I mean, for Uber and for Consumer Reports, I mean, how do we know that?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I mean, we actually surveyed our members late last year on this very question, specifically regarding robo-taxi technology, full self-driving technology. And two main insights from our work there that I want to share. So we found that 70% of consumers said that they would want stronger safety standards for autonomous vehicles than for regular passenger vehicles, and that nearly 60% said they would support something like a vision test, that being a way to evaluate how well an autonomous system can reliably detect safely objects, other vehicles, people, pedestrians on the road, to a set of federal standards, right? And I think what that broadly tells us is that consumers want this technology they want deployment of this technology that's grounded in some sort of binding, measurable standard. I think a lot of that's peace of mind and just, again, being a scenario where they're willing to hand over the driving task, and then they want those standards to be rooted in this idea that the safety promises, the potential safety benefits aren't just assumed, that those need to be proven, right?
Yeah, and I'll speak from the Uber perspective. We've got, our very large mobility network, and right now with our partners, we're running a hybrid network. And through the support cases that come in, experiences from those who have ridden in autonomous vehicles where they're available, you get the real feedback. What did everyone feel about their ride? Did they feel unsafe? And we look at all of that. It's, taken very seriously. When those things come in, it's like, oh, okay, well, why did that happen? Go back to our partners and say, why did that happen and how can we make it better? And I think that having that voice of the consumer real time is really helpful. And again, it's something that we need to cycle through and keep looking at. It's not ever done.
Yeah. Well, and I think some of those lessons, Uber's learned through the hard way, trial and error, and doing it right on the roads. I used to work in the car sharing industry at Zipcar, and a lot of those things were learned by understanding when we failed and let the customer down. Yeah. How? So I was down in Atlanta. I don't even know, earlier this year. time and space, you know, I don't know. But
some point.
At some point. And there were Waymos there, and I rode in one. But B, there was a panel on policy, and I found some industry advocacy groups, you know, some lobbying groups were asking for a national framework in this area. They weren't asking really to be regulated, but they were asking for a national framework in AV safety, because they're saying, you know, the patchwork of, I forget, there's 16 states that have no legislation, but, you know, there's the threat of it. There's other states like California that have very strong policies. And then there's ones like Michigan where we've thrown the doors open. But all of that is causing a lot of uncertainty, and they're worried, I think, that it will interrupt deployment cadence. I think that's, hopefully I'm not, we should put one of them on the panel and we can ask. But do we need a federal framework? Like what will that give us in addition to, you know, certainty across the 50 states? What would that look like? How might that work in the kind of state-federal relationship of licensing and regulating that we have now? That's a lot of questions all at once. So, you know, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I can start really quick. So it's a really good question. And, you know, I think traditionally the sort of state federal breakdown of roles there is, you know, the federal government regulates the performance of the vehicle and the state regulates the operation of the vehicle, the driver, right? Obviously with autonomous technology, that's not as simple when you have sort of the system itself as the driver. But I do absolutely think we can have a system where the federal government oversees or administers at some point what would be, I guess, in effect, like a national driver's test in how we're thinking about setting a performance standard for the safe deployment of AVs, and then states could still maintain their operation authority to determine, you know, when, where, how, and, you know, and under what conditions these systems would be allowed to operate in local communities. I think that's something that can be achievable. So.
Yeah, I'll add from an insurer's perspective, having a national framework should lend to greater market stability. And I talk about market stability through the lens of insurance rates. A little bit earlier, I talked about the need for us to have an understanding for how things will perform on road. And, you know, for the insurer, it's often a backward-looking organization, right? We leverage years and years of empirical on-road data to inform what we're going to charge for automobiles or for certain drivers on a going-forward basis. That does not exist as we think about autonomy and autonomous vehicles. That is a nascent data set that we do not have the luxury of being able to react to. We're trying to better understand what that will mean on a going-forward basis. And so, you know, if we had a framework that would help us understand, or at least create an even playing field for how and where these are deployed, it gives us a sense for what that means from a rate perspective, right? Which should better allow us to match price to risk, which for the consumer matters a lot. If we don't get that right off the top and we're charging too much, our manufacturer is going to have a hard time selling their automobiles. If we're undercharging relative to that risk, that's a pleasant experience to begin with, becomes really problematic as the experience starts to catch up and you start to experience rate increases coming into your mailbox. And so it's problematic for myriad reasons for the insurer when it's the kind of this Wild West setting that we're in right now. So any advancement towards a comprehensive framework would be outstanding.
I wonder if it has to be a federal framework exactly from the federal government, or does it just need to be a de facto emergent standard that does the same job? I suspect that the federal government is going to be reluctant to, you know, move into attempting to regulate an area where traditionally it hasn't, you know, the driver function. And I think that there may be some downsides or risks of them doing that as well. Talking to a colleague just before this, you know, setting any sort of a standard and then having everyone move to that standard, knowing that it's going to be, you know, a federal action or federal standard for a long time. It may be premature to do that in an industry that's growing and adapting so quickly. You know, that can set a unnecessarily low target or expectation around which the whole industry then sticks at a time when tremendous benefits are coming out of innovation. So I think some sort of standard or framework that helps move some of the risk that the individual operators will have, give them some sense of being able to point to, well, this is the way as a nation we generally handle it, so they don't feel the litigation threat so strongly, is absolutely necessary to accelerate the industry. But I'm not sure that I would count on, federal government as being the source for that.
Okay.
Can I just say one thing there? I think that's a really good point, especially if we're thinking about federal standards as written for regular human-driven vehicles and them sort of being these binary deterministic questions, like a car can either stop within a certain distance or it can't, right? But I think there's absolutely a way to think about a federal standardized framework for safe deployment of AVs that's more probabilistic in nature and is more process-based. I do think that's a good point, but I just wanted to add that sort of caveat there.
Okay.
I'll jump in on that
Yeah,
because I think
please.
part of we cannot expect to kind of match the level of innovation of this industry with all tools for regulation that kind of take 3-5 years. And there's reasons for that. But precisely on that notion, like we need to find ways to create standards that kind of move in time, like and there's groups, bodies that can assess whether the standard is current and represents the needs and the reality and the state of our knowledge, and kind of continue to move the ball forward, but not to just say that then therefore we can't do it, because then that's just kind of like, I guess nihilistic in nature. So I think that, like there's elements of a framework that would make a lot of sense, like some entry level kind of like capability test, right, some general performance assessment, and then respecting the different ranges of, I guess, our federal structure. And I think that could work very well, because in the case of California, as you're referencing, we've amassed a lot of experience. California's, the first legislation on AVs is from 2012. The first regulations are from 2014, and that has helped us stand up the industry in the state in some level, and now we're continuing to incorporate lessons learned into our regulations. And not that they're perfect, but at least there's that incremental process. And if the nature of that paper that we referenced before is because comes out of the struggle a little bit of the regulations are not moving fast enough to reflect the realities on the ground. And so I think that is a new challenge, which is like I suppose like an institutional policy design challenge, as well as the technical challenge of designing the framework.
Yeah, I remember the disengagement reports, right, from
Exactly.
early in California's history.
Yeah, that's a very interesting kind of
Yeah.
both technical, but like it kind of describes the whole industry. I don't know if everyone's getting the reference, but California requires disengagement reporting to all AV operators, but to, I guess industry found ways to kind of have different interpretations of what that actually meant. And so that meant that like what we receive, or like what's, I guess, the DMV and what's published is not helpful to anybody, because everyone's reporting very different things, if at all. And so, they're trying to tighten the screws on that. But it took them, what, I suppose 6 years.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not even finalized just yet. So anyways,
Yeah.
that's just an interesting example.
I do think a really good federal role is data consistency, meaningful data and data consistency in terms of collection, so that when you do have localities like San Francisco that is out there, it's doing testing, it's collecting, how do we make sure that we're establishing a national framework for the data? Are we collecting the right things to inform and allow that innovation to propagate quickly? I think that's a really needed, excellent federal role.
Mm-hmm. And I'll jump in on that, because I think data is the other critical point, that there's very limited kind of transparency and awareness of what's going on. Like some of our regulators get a fair amount of data, but the data is not made public anyway. And there's reasons for that, obviously, in terms of trade secrets and private privacy, but it still kind of prevents this larger network of actors, of stakeholders, to leverage the experiences on the ground to the advancement of the space as a whole, including, in our case, cities also not being able to perform our role of kind of better managing our streets and planning for the future of those streets in a way that incorporates this new technology. So,
Yeah. Cooper, you said something really interesting. You said probabilistic, which I've learned through osmosis, being around Greg and others in our office. But no, I think the current testing regime for NCAP is relatively deterministic. You're passing, here's the static test, maybe a robotic proxy, comes out in front of this vehicle at a certain closing distance, and that's that. You can repeat that test over and over. In an AI-enabled era, though, you don't get that comfort of determinism, and you're in a probabilistic world. What are other probabilistic safety regimes that exist either federally or states or elsewhere, that would be interesting models to look at for vehicle safety for AVs?
I don't know the specifics, but I know that the EU has been working towards like scenario cataloging. I will add that they have a type approval regime in Europe, so I think just in terms of their ability to be in a position to regulate AVs, I think they're starting a bit ahead than where we are. But I know that the EU is looking at like doing scenario cataloging.
I think there's another good human analogy here to the way, again, we sort of evaluate teenagers driving.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, what we do with them is we put them in known hard situations, like unprotected left turns and two-lane roundabouts and merging on the freeway. And those are like the deterministic tests, right? But we also then drive 50 hours with our teenagers, which is the probabilistic stuff. It's the put the teenager out into the real world with real world chaos and see how they handle it, right? And I think both of those are critical for assessing AV safety. And that's actually the AV safety assessment that we're developing at Mcity is a combination of actual scenario-based testing that we do, as well as creating this simulated large adversarial driving world that we can put the AV into and see how it reacts to the chaos of the world. And so I think that, the idea of a lot of automotive testing to date has been very deterministic. And in this new AV world, we got to do it more like the way we test ourselves, which is some determinism and some of the probabilistic approach.
And there's, good.
No, please, Brian.
Well, to say, a federally operated analogy of that would be pilots, pilot licensing.
Yeah.
There's the, knowledge test where you have to pass the knowledge test, how much you know, how much can you recall, can you do route planning and weight calculations, and then the practical test, right? And that is probabilistic. I guess I would call it subjective more, but the same idea, right? You don't know what you're going to be confronted with when you're in your pilot's test, when you're doing your solo with your instructor. But there is someone who's evaluating, and they're making subjective assessments about, did this make sense? Could I understand that the pilot was going through a rational process, and maybe they did it a different way, but the end result was okay, and they seem to utilize the knowledge and the training that they got. That's subjective. You can't do subjective testing at scale, though. So probabilistic evaluation probably is the answer to that. But there's probably a number of different examples of federal evaluations where that subjective or probabilistic sort of approach is used.
Just one comment on that. I mean, from the insurer's perspective, this is a really timely and impactful conversation. And we had one of our senior executives up here actually earlier this week interfacing with the team from UMTRI and Mcity to better understand some of these realities that as an industry, right, auto industry, historically, we have leveraged deterministic outcomes to inform what our rate set will look like on a going forward basis. Things are evolving far too rapidly right now for us to be reliant upon backward looking data. We're going to have to somehow get more comfortable in assessing probabilistic outcomes and talking to regulators and legislators about the inclusion of those outcomes in our rate sets. And that is a challenging conversation, but it's one that we look forward to getting a greater understanding of. And tip of the cap to the work being done here at University of Michigan, what y'all are doing with digital twins and forecasting into what that reality could look like with the TerraSim program and others is genuinely groundbreaking, and we look very much forward to better understanding what that implication is to the insurance industry.
Thanks, John. Go ahead, Amy.
I'll be quick. I know
No.
We're doing a lot of talking. One thing that we haven't mentioned up here yet, and that's part of Uber's safety assessment program for our partners, is we look at, well, I heard the word framework, which I really like, and that's what we call it as well, but it's basically three main components. We always hear a lot about the safety of the autonomous vehicle portion. The developers that are making the vehicle, that putting it out there, that's, you know, kind of always front and center. But there's two other components that we really focus on at Uber as well, and that is safety of the organization. How is the organization built? Is it built with a safety culture? Do folks within the company feel that they can come forward with potential risks and not be, you know, reprimanded for it? It has to be a just culture. So, you know, the way you build your safety policies, the way you're keeping up with hazard identification, safety performance indicators, that's really important to be built into the company. And so that's something we look at when we're partnering with a company. Similarly, safety of the operations. So yeah, you've got the vehicle in the middle, the org on one side, and then safety of the operations. How do they run their day-to-day? How is the fleet operations run? What happens in the event of an incident? Are you prepared? Do you have the right processes in place? Do you have the right people in place? There's a whole lot that goes into that we don't hear a lot about, but, you know, actually doing this real time and having this experience, you know, that's really something we try to get prepared on up front, because we know that things are gonna happen, and, you know, they're not always the most horrible thing that could happen, but you can always learn from it. So definitely feeding that back in and to continuous improvement is really important.
That makes sense.
Yeah. No, I would just add to that, that precisely that reflects the nature that different companies look very differently and they approach the problem in very different ways. And that is in part the challenge, both for what you're doing at Uber, kind of bringing different providers, but also for a city that is taking all of these different operators. And so in San Francisco, we had a very kind of live kind of demonstration of kind of different approaches to the same problem, where the technology might not have been necessarily the issue, but potentially could have been just the business drivers for like the AV kind of cases that we kind of had. So I think that's an important kind of both thing to be very aware of, that the safety is much broader. And then I think goes back to the notion of why we need certain kind of risk mitigation tools in our regulatory frameworks.
Great. I'm looking at our time. We really are talking. It's good.
Nobody had any questions.
I'm gonna ask one last thing, and then hopefully we'll have time for a few questions. Okay, so who and what is the potential model then for engaging in societal agreement on these numbers? Yeah, it's an easy question. No, you know, what is kind of the right group? Who can withstand public scrutiny? You know, and how? I do like that idea that, you know, the straw man concept. But to date, you know, no one company wants to go out there and face that alone. So how do we do that? Is academia or public-private partnerships? What are we doing? And then we'll look for questions.
All of the above.
Yeah. Okay.
And that goes back to one of the topics of the last panel, which is collaboration. It's essential. That was one of the things that, you know, you know, personally, that's something I feel very passionate about, but then, you know, it's part of the AVSC's goal. We're not competing on safety. We have to work together. There's no way around it.
Yeah, I think that there's many necks will have to be stuck out simultaneously, I think. You know, I think the AV developers and operators themselves are in a very good position to suggest frameworks that are rational, engineering based, but to some extent put those out as straw men too, to try to provoke the public discourse by volunteering some of the ways that they think we should be thinking about them. I do think that, you know, elected officials and, you know, public group, I can imagine that, you know, as we do have these frameworks to think about how AVs work and how to think about their safety in ways that citizens can understand and engage with, then having sort of town halls or gauging public reaction to that is also going to have to be going on simultaneously. I don't think that anyone is going to get far on their own without some sort of a coordinated multi-stakeholder effort to advance all of these together. It's hard to know how you coordinate such a thing. Bill?
Yeah, I think exactly to that point and to Amy's earlier point about ensuring not just that the systems and the vehicles themselves are safe, but that the organizations deploying them have a culture of safety that baked into any framework that we come up with. I think it's important that we'd also consider, again, in the sort of spirit of collaboration as well, independent third party, whether it's verification or certification along a manufacturer's or developer's self-certification. Yeah.
Okay. Francine, we've got Vicky, we've got a couple. I'm gonna take questions until somebody is like, absolutely no more, we have to eat lunch. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jackie Charnaga. I cover the automotive industry for the Detroit Free Press.
Hi, Jackie.
Hi. So you ended this panel discussing sort of the proper entity that will make these judgments about the safety of AVs, but not necessarily what's it going to take to force that coalition to be formed. Right now we make decisions as a society about how we feel about AVs in court, both the court of public opinion and the comment sections of stories about the fatalities, and in literal court, where family members of victims sort of plead the case that it's the company at fault for that person's life. So in terms of when we'll reach a critical mass of how much is too much to determine how safe is safe enough, is it that we need a certain level of lives lost in order to force the issue? My first question, sorry.
Well, I think that's a great point. I think everyone here wants to avoid this question being answered in jury boxes, right? For many reasons, right? Number one, it's too late. Lives have been lost during that time, and also I don't know that in court cases the full richness of the issues and all that has been done can be processed and conclusions can be drawn in that environment. So we want to avoid that being the way that this is ultimately decided. But your point is very well taken, right? What mechanism do we have in place to make this discussion and collaboration happen? It's happening, I guess, to some extent in events like this, conferences, symposiums where people get together, but it does feel sort of a little bit unsatisfying. If there is a partnership where we can form something focused on this multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary coordination, and set ourselves some milestones and some goals. I don't think that really exists, in an explicit form right now. But maybe that's something that comes out of this.
Yeah, and to address the sort of critical mass kind of part of your question, right? I think there's a couple things that are driving this to be the moment, right? One thing is watching Waymo's progress, right? They are marching, right? AVs are, it's a reality, it's happening, right? And so before people were like, is this possible, is this not possible, right? They were in that phase. Now we're in the phase of this is possible, it's being done. So that creates some urgency of we got to get ready. Another thing that's driving it, I think, is, if you look at that Waymo framework I put up, I can point to non-Waymo groups that are working on each and every point of that framework, right? So I think there's also been this critical mass of groups getting involved. And, I think it also has really sort of permeated, everybody's consciousness that if there's, we think about bad cops and good cops in terms of regulation, but right now we're at no cop, and no cop metastasizes into a judicial cop, which none of us want, right? So I think that's also another thing that's driving some urgency. And, you know, so I think we got to figure out what's the forum for driving this forward, but I do feel like there's momentum now that we didn't have previously.
My second question is about the AV driver's test. I think that's pretty fantastic. The idea that we have to test humans before they are road legal. We have a long history of standards for how we determine if that person is road ready. We have 100 years of driving experience to understand how humans behave behind the wheel. But the idea is, you know, we have an understanding of human limitation. You know, what is reasonable amount of time to react to an accident? But if the car is running on AI, ostensibly the car can think a lot faster and it actually has time to make a decision, let alone a reaction. So the question of, you know, if we're going to be able to test these vehicles, I certainly don't have the capacity of LiDAR. You know, I don't have the reach of an autonomous car. So you could argue that it's going to be doing better in terms of a vision test or a federal standard than a human. So it should be easier for it to get certified. Mm-hmm. It's not really a question, that's kind of a comment.
I love that observation. I was thinking about, you know, Waymo has the non-impaired eyes on the road driver model, which is the world's worst acronym. I don't know. But they've taken, you know, a public stab at, okay, let's take a driver who I don't know how many of us in the room qualify as, but let's start there, which is a bar well above, you know, the average human.
Yeah, let's take one last question over here.
I like that.
Maybe
Okay.
just quickly to this point,
please.
it's not a fail-safe test, it's just a base level. And I think what we saw in San Francisco is that once full-on driverless operations started, many of these vehicles started to kind of fail at things that a human driver would not necessarily fail. Like when they run, like there was an emergency response vehicle on the road, like they kind of struggled to kind of pull over to the side or to improvise when like the conditions required to do something a little bit more ad hoc from what the regular rules of the road kind of dictate. Or yeah, kind of other things that we saw were like struggling to deal with human traffic control or taping of like work zones or emergency zones. So things that actually humans can do very well, like these vehicles can. So like I think that part of the design of the test has to include like think outside of the box, right? And kind of incorporate elements that we would not think necessarily are key.
Dr. Smith-Jackson from Regional Transit Authority of Southeast Michigan. I'm really glad to see that there's a public agency on the dais here because public agencies aren't known to be very risk acceptance. And you talk about having a national framework. When you talk about safety, it's very, is it safe or is it not safe? There's no kind of like, it's binary. How are you planning to get a risk-averse group of people to develop a framework for the AV to move forward?
Is that a question for me?
Thank God I'm not a panelist. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I think that like the part of the answer is the consensus, right? Like to try to build it together. So that way, kind of like some of the idea, for instance, in us putting this paper, which is a different level of risk, was that, you know, like it's very conceptual and it has to carry a lot of kind of analysis or probabilistic analysis, which I think would be the next step of that work. But it's just to get an idea out, and some of that risk is precisely, it's much more minimal, but it's getting a lot of criticism for it. And I think that part of the challenge to all of us here on the table and on the other side is to really kind of break those kind of seemingly natural antagonistic roles of how sometimes that's how it plays, that we both want to be risk averse against one another and try to kind of focus more on where is the shared win and kind of let go a little bit of some of those fears. I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but.
Well, you know, one good thing about risk-averse people is they're risk-averse across lots of different topics. And, you know, we were talking about, you know, what are the tool gaps, you know, as a previous conversation we were having. And I think there is a tool gap in being understanding the trade space between different policy decisions that public officials have to weigh. So, clearly there's risk associated with authorizing autonomous vehicle operations, but there are other risks too, right? There's lack of loss of opportunity for improved mobility. In some cases, AVs might actually contribute to safety or contribute to traffic. I mean, so understanding when you're going to set a policy or an expectation around the safety of autonomous vehicles, if we could understand through the simulation studies that we do how that trades off with other things that policymakers have to do, I think that gives them some framework for saying, okay, this is where I want my community to be. We want to balance being technology supportive and innovative and job growth and these other things. It's hard to just set it in isolation. It's just a one-dimensional sort of thing.
So I think we have probably time for just one last question.
One last question. Okay.
Hi, Gopi Surnila, ex-Ford, and
Seems to be a theme. That's good.
same team too, really.
Excellent.
My question is around the way the autonomous vehicles are operating in the environments, right? It's like, they have their own specific ODD, whatever, Waymo or whatever, take Auroras, and they are making the decision that, okay, it is safe enough for that ODD, that environment. We'll do in Arizona, but not in New York because it snows there, right? But when we are comparing whether it is safe as humans, then we are taking collectively of the humans operating in all the environments and being able to do that. Does it make sense for us to actually think more in terms of safe in each situations, right, in ODD, break that down to say, and compare that against the humans in that space, right? Not just humans, it's like, you're putting, right, they are driving in dark or whatever, right? Humans may be very bad drivers in dark, but like, LiDAR helps us in the dark, and that is much. Vulnerable road users, autonomous vehicles are not great, and even work zones is not great, but other places it is, right? So just for us to be able to say, unless we are collectively moving the whole thing to be better, move better in the spaces, and then it allows us to actually operate in that. I just want to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
I want to jump in real quick. I mean, one thing that some of us were discussing last night over dinner was, one way to decompose that, it seems very important, is there's the mode of operation or the design domain where the expectation is I'm following rules.
Yeah.
And then there's other environments that are totally different where you expect improvisation, where improvisation is required, these off-nominal sorts of conditions. And I think it's very hard to have an approach or a framework that's going to work for both of those. And I think it's a real challenge to sort of treat those separately.
Yeah, that's sort of exactly what I was going to say, and just point out there's, at least in my mind, a bit of a paradox where on the one hand, there's this expectation of autonomous systems being safer than human drivers, right? We want that. That's part of the allure, right? But on the other hand, we also want autonomous systems to perform like humans would in the sense of like roadmanship, right? So I think it's just a little bit funny just in terms of how we discuss these things, right?
I do think, the thing that's in San Francisco's proposal is the right way, right? Where you start with a really small operational design domain, right? And then you gradually increase it, right? And within that small operational design domain, the companies prove that they can handle all sort of the known stuff, but then you watch it and see how well it improvises, right? And if it does a good job, then you expand, right? And just sort of use that approach, like you're saying, Gopi, to just sort of eventually encompass, the United States, right?
Sure. And I think to that point, then the standards or the benchmark can be localized first and then advanced to, like, one of the reasons that we were like hesitant to put out standards on a document is because there aren't any standards even for San Francisco about kind of like some of that level of performance, say how often are private vehicles or human drivers obstructing fire response. And so, like, I guess we just came up with some tricks to just kind of like, I guess, get a sense of what that could be. But yeah, the part of the big challenge to the work that we're describing today is actually developing the benchmark, what ought to be, right? Because it could be like, at what level do we satisfy? Is it like for cities like San Francisco, like then very different rural, and like you're saying, like, weather varies also, and so we could have, the standard could be just very, a very complex kind of, I don't know, prism of standards.
Well, please join me in thanking this incredible group.